Recording. Hello and welcome everybody. This is Kubernetes SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting. Today is September 6, 2023. We are in September. Can you believe that? It's amazing how the time flies. And we have a very nice agenda today. Thank you for the people that has been contributing to that. So without any more introductions, let's start with Han, Joe, and Jordan if he joins.
Yeah, I can kick this off. So if you guys had attended SIG Arch or what was the other one that we went to? Working Group LTS, then you guys have already heard the spiel. I am just making the rounds to all the relevant SIGs to make sure and to get a temperature check, make sure that people find this palatable, and if so, we will move on to the cat phase. So the proposal is linked in our agenda doc, but basically it comes down to we want to introduce new functionality into not only the API server, but every single component, such that during an upgrade cycle, we can start a component, we can upgrade a component so that its binary version is like, let's say our cluster's on 1.28. We upgrade a component to 1.29. We want to be able to start that component in a mode that is compatible to 1.28. And this means, like all APIs, like all resources that are being served, all feature flags that are enabled would be consistent with the set that was enabled for 1.28. And the reason why we would want to do this is we want to make the steps for upgrading more granular, right? Because when we fail during an upgrade, depending on when we fail, we have more information about like what around actually failed, right? If we have smaller steps, there's also less to rewind if we need to roll back. So one of the things that I am proposing is adding some metadata to feature flags so that we can actually compute the set of feature flags that would be enabled at version X. And in terms of resources, what I have been thinking is something akin to our pre-release lifecycle generator, which already pre-generates like deprecated, removed, and introduced methods for our resources. I want to introduce when that resource was default enabled, and I want this to be mandatory. So probably not pre-release lifecycle gen, but I wanted to be doing something similar to that. And that is, I guess, the crux of the proposal, and yeah, how it affects API machinery, since it obviously affects API machinery. There are more applications, obviously. So if we're able to start with compatible, if we're able to start a binary on 1.29 in compatibility mode 1.28, if we change some of our internal policies, it also becomes possible to start these binaries on compatibility versions that extend past n-1. For instance, we could start a binary on n-3. This would theoretically enable skip level upgrades. And then what we could do is we could upgrade a binary to n+3 with compatibility mode n-3. And then we could do like a stepwise bump of the flags, compatibility mode flags, in order to do like a skip level upgrade. That would be sort of the high level overview of how that could possibly work. Any thoughts, opinions, feedback? If you hate it, I would love to hear it.
Do you plan to have any kind of interlock between, say, a component like the Kube controller manager and the Kube API server to see whether they disagree in some incompatible way about
Compatibility mode?
about which level they are starting with?
No, I think each controller would, like, the thing that we are considering is, like, Joe is actually working on this component resource proposal, which is somewhat running in parallel, but that would allow us to model component life cycles. I have not really been thinking much about cross-component skew, though I suppose we could build that in once we have these component registration things. And Joe has a hand.
Yeah, I think the answer is not for this particular sub feature, but in general, I think that's the direction we're headed towards, because this allows us to be very clear on, what our compatible version is. And so, like Han mentioned, we want to build up more visibility onto what all the versions of things are as, API objects. And once we do that, I think detecting version skew becomes a lot more viable. So we don't have a specific plan yet, but I think this is an enabler to get us there. And I think it's a really interesting idea.
I think
Jordan
Jacob.
seems. Oh, Joe has a hand.
There is
Yeah.
Diego and Jordan. I don't know if any.
Yeah, I saw the document before and didn't think of this, but Han, as you were speaking, you talked about it enables more granular upgrade, but manually. I want to make sure that we're not changing the default behavior. Like if someone does nothing and doesn't pass in the
It would work
flag.
exactly the same way.
Okay, that was the thing that I just wanted to double check. Thanks.
Yes. Yeah. So basically, you can use the sledgehammer to upgrade your cluster perfectly
If
fine.
you do more work, you can do better things. If you do
Exactly.
the same amount of work, you get the same behavior. Okay, thanks.
Exactly.
That's what I want to make sure.
To David's question about interlocks, this is actually something I thought about. Even if we didn't add any of this stuff, like we say things about, this component must not be newer than that component, or the kubelet must be within this many versions. Like, I kind of think it would make sense to already add some of those checks. And like when the kubelet starts up, if it's running against an API server out of skew, like by default, the kubelet should say, no, I can't do this. Or a controller running against an API server that's out of supported skew by default should say, no, I can't do this. Maybe we could let people like ignore version skew checks or something. I don't know. But taking some of what's already in our supported skew doc and making it safer or more obvious when people are doing things out of bounds. I don't know.
More
It could be
obvious is what
something-
I'm going for, because I think this is going to get more and more people trying to run skewed who maybe haven't thought about many of the edges, particularly around downgrades. I've seen people screw up downgrade already. And I know here we're going to get faced with questions like, if I run a newer kubelet in an older compatibility mode, can I run that against my my older API server? Because in a downgrade, that's like exactly what people want. Like my control plane went bad. Let me put my kubelet in a mode where I haven't disrupted workloads, but I can run at the older level and back level my control plane. Like, I think stories like that are going to be likely.
Yeah, so even if the checks are simplistic in nature, like kubelet starts up and checks the version of the API server it's running against and makes sure it's within bounds. A simplistic check like that is way better than what we do today, which is no check, run, and then maybe fail in weird ways in edge cases.
I agree. On the whole, I like the approach. I had a couple minor questions on there, but nothing I thought was structural.
About the rest of the people, any opinions, interest? Is this a problem today? Would this solve problems?
Be clear, this is not speak now or forever hold your peace. This is going to turn into an actual cap, and there will be plenty of opportunities for feedback.
And bike shedding, you don't have to bike shed now, you can bike shed later.
But early feedback influences direction more easily. We'll just say that.
Yeah, if people are unsure what feedback to give, one thing I've found useful is to read this and then try and imagine which upgrade paths you would want to use with this and see if you think it supports them. I like to try and simulate different types of upgrades with this because there's more that become possible and some of them are much safer than others. So it's a good kind of thought experiment.
If you really want to look at the upgrade flow, like the testing matrix that we have a little small section with the testing matrix, and that pretty much gives you like the envisioned flow, right? Like start binary version X, compatibility version X. Then the control plane ends up in a mixed state where we're upgrading like one of the control plane instances to X+1, but only one of them. So then we have a mix of binary versions, but the compatibility version is the same. So everything in the cluster should theoretically be thinking that it's on 1.28, even though it's a mix of 1.28, 1.29. Then we upgrade all of the control plane instances to 1.29, but it's still pretending to be a 1.28. And then is the real part. This is probably where we would expect to encounter some failures. And this is also where we expect UVIP and stuff to come into play, which is control plane at binary version X+1 and mixed compatibility versions. And then once all of that is done, we upgrade the compatibility version to X+1 and probably kick off something like storage version migration or something automatically.
David, you have a hand up.
Yeah, I was going to point out that one of the sharp edges that we have hit is turning on and off flags individually, is that you have to adjust the runtime config at the same time that you modify feature gates. And the runtime config has a granularity of group version, but the feature gate has a logical granularity of resource in that group version. So you can, we made it work for individual resources for extensions v1 beta 1, but then eliminated it after that.
You made it work for everything when beta APIs became off by default.
I thought I did, but either I didn't update the help, maybe I didn't update the help.
You didn't update the help.
Ah, naughty. Ben, go fix the help.
Past David already addressed current David's.
That guy's clever. Someone should hire him. Yeah. All right. Then never mind that. We won't hit that edge. It'll be possible to do what we need.
Yay, problem solved.
Okay, so next steps, I think this turns into a cap.
Yep. By KubeCon is the goal. Yeah.
Okay. Are you planning to have something in person at KubeCon to discuss this? Like,
yeah, if you is API Machinery having a face-to-face? Because that would probably be best.
We'll actually be there. So I'll be there.
Okay. Yeah, we should have a face-to-face. You guys should register for. I know the instrumentation is doing one. Hopefully, it doesn't overlap. Because I would love to attend the API Machinery face-to-face.
Okay, let's organize something. Sounds good. Very good. Okay, unless there is anybody else that wants to talk about this one, let's move to the next one. Thank you, Han, Joe, Jordan. Mo, are you there? You want to take this one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Here. And nilekh is here with me too. And I've lost Zoom. Where did Zoom go? There it is. Okay, I found Zoom again.
Oh,
Excellent.
he's there and has just unmuted. Yes.
Yeah, do you want to open the HackMD? So let's see, we spoke about this, I don't know how many meetings back, some amount of meetings back, but earlier this year. And what I wanted to get from this meeting is just a sense of agreement on like sort of goals and non-goals for such a KEP. Because I think that sort of directly influences what the design of the KEP would actually do. Do folks need like a few seconds to just read the little bit? It's not much. It's basically like the summary and goals and non-goals.
I think at least some of the non-goals are worth going into. A defense of hang on, I think something just moved. Yeah, a defense of why an API should not handle HA API servers is probably worth greater consideration when bringing it into core.
So you're referring to the any modification regarding storage version API for HA servers, that one?
Yeah, as I recall, it's an alpha API maybe. And if we missed something that we need to have in order to work with HA API servers without greater coordination, because right now it's all possible with external coordination, but without external coordination, that seems worthwhile if we bring it in tree.
I guess so. My thought process was basically what is like the smallest thing we can do here, right? So my hope was that could be a logical follow-up where we have the capability to drive storage migration in tree, and then we start adding capabilities to automatically drive it based on criteria, whether the criteria be schema changes or key rotation or whatever.
Yeah, so by bringing it in tree, it seems more likely that we will grow. It seems likely that we will grow adoption. And if part of the thing we have difficulty with is an API structure that doesn't work well with HA API servers, I think we'd be better served to correct that during this move with a V1 Alpha 2 than leaving it broken.
Maybe I'm misremembering. I thought storage version API functioned. It just didn't function for CR custom resources. Like it was correct. It just wasn't complete. Am I remembering that wrong?
Well, so unless I have misremembered which resource it says, is this the storage version? Is this the API contained inside the storage version migrator that you're talking about moving, or is this the storage version API that is contained in tree?
Yeah,
today?
it's just the one that's contained in tree right now today. That's what it's saying, that we will not mess with that one.
Okay, that one is already beta and it does already have the HA pieces.
Wait, storage version went beta? When did they go beta? Did I just miss
Did
this?
it go beta? I thought that there were pieces that were added by, was it CC?
Now I'm just curious. I'm gonna go look. Storage version.
I thought I remembered wiring in the registry pieces that she needed.
When I searched
I
for
was-
storage version, I only
I was going through that cap that listed this, and I think Mo was one of the interested person who was trying to implement it, but I couldn't find any references, so I thought it's not implemented. Maybe I'm wrong.
let's see. What
I'm going through my own archives and trying to remember.
I just shared the KEP YAML on chat, and I think I got the right one.
Yeah, so stage alpha forever ago. That sounds about right.
Okay. I'm looking at the API registration and it does look to be still alpha.
David,
Alright.
maybe you're mixing. Maybe we did move to beta the API server identity, which was part of this. But
Yes. Okay. That you're right. I'm mixing those two in my head.
right.
Yeah, that
So
one is beta.
that was a prerequisite for this one, but then we never moved to beta.
Also, storage version hash is beta, I think.
In the discovery API or in the storage version API?
The discovery. I think that one's beta.
Yeah, but we said we would deprecate that. So
Oh, okay.
because we have the storage version. But I just linked the PR from Roy that was going to fix it so storage version API actually was correctly honored for custom resources. And that never made it and hasn't progressed. So, but the gist of that bullet point is saying, I don't want to try to solve all of those problems. Now, if there are problems within the custom resource APIs that exist out of tree today, then yes, most definitely we should fix those before moving them in tree or as process of moving them in tree.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so I would just, many things named storage version, had the wrong one in my head. As long as the one that we're moving, we address a concern like that during the move, that works.
Yeah, definitely. So nominally, the high level goals of this KEP right now, as stated, are there will exist something inside of controller manager that will make it so that a human being or an automated entity can ask for storage migration to happen, and then it will happen. Which APIs that are, it doesn't really super matter. But it basically says that we will not automatically do it on like random Kubernetes schema changes. We will not automatically do it on like Kubernetes encryption at rest changes. We will not automatically do it on any interval. Basically leaves all the automatic parts out. It just says that you have the capability, you can drive it easily if you are so willing to either manually drive it or write a tool to drive it. Does that seem like an okay scope?
What would it take to give you confidence to turn it on, to do things like migrating existing resources? Like I'm selfishly imagining the end of extensions v1 beta 1.
Wait, sorry, where did extensions v1 beta 1 come from? I thought we already killed that.
We killed the exposed served pieces, but we still have to be able to decode them because there's no guarantee that they are not stored in etcd today. And one of the reasons for this tool is to allow us to permanently retire them. We wouldn't be able to do it willy-nilly because you don't want to make it impossible for people to use your new client to talk to your old server. But on some cycle, we would finally be able to remove the old serializations.
Yeah, so right now, as sort of written, there isn't, because there's no automatic triggering of it, it doesn't give us that yet. If we want that, I wasn't exactly sure what the automatic triggering would be on to give us that guarantee that we can finally make extensions v1 beta 1 go away for good.
Yeah, so right now that's listed as a goal. Like dropping old API schemas, it's flagged as unclear, but it's in the goals list and it's not clear.
All of goals and non-goals are basically fungible at this exact moment. That is the point of this conversation, what goes in which list.
The one that I actually hear way more than dropping Kubernetes Go types is migrating and retiring a CRD version. Yeah, David. Like CRD authors being able to update a manifest, say, I don't serve this version anymore, run the migration for me, drop it from stored versions, and then in a month or 3 months or after a week or like whenever that's complete, now I can update my CRD and finally drop this v1 alpha 1 version. I hear that way more than dimensions v1 beta 1 types, even though I wish we could delete those.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that those are the same problem, though, right? Is like we have a schema that used to be used, and we don't know if it's still used.
Yes, though there's more to it, that like around tweaking the storage version and like being able to do that in a declarative way would be, that seems like a more widely useful goal than letting us delete nodes from Kubernetes. So I would like to see that as a goal to consider in the shape of the API, how you drive this, how you request this, what it does. Is it just the storage migration, or is it also taking care of clearing out storage versions, status stored versions for you? Yeah.
Okay. Fair. Man, I was trying to make this kept small. You guys are just making it larger.
Only as large as it needs to be.
Okay. So we want, as part of this cap, a goal for being able to drop those. Okay. What about other stuff? Is there other things that folks feel is sort of necessary for this to be a reasonable move, basically?
I would really like to see this API use the new streaming watch capability that we're building. I don't think I would predicate that. I don't think I predicate a move on it, but as a GA criteria, I think that would be really helpful for the memory footprint of a QAPI server when this is running automatically and trying to do those conversions. We've definitely hit spikes, even with pagination, trying to do this.
Remind me again, David, is the streaming watch just lets you skip the list and you just watch?
Yeah, it's the list via watch, and it makes the memory footprint a lot more reliable. It's, as I said, I wouldn't say it was required for anything other than stable, but it keeps the memory footprint really small.
Does streaming watch, we had the storage version migrator made use of a particular point in time, so a particular resource version, and
pagination,
ability to paginate through.
Yeah.
And it actually didn't care about new stuff that showed up because it was only migrating things as of the resource at it. So it did weird to let it resume at a particular index, irrespective of resource version. Does the streaming watch get us the right pieces of that?
It helps.
Is it index?
It helps if you have large. It helps if you have very large individual objects where pagination, like, yeah, you paginated at 500, but they're still individually big and we're having issues with them.
Yeah, because the important thing with this is that we make progress through the key set at a point in time, and streaming watch is time or order of change oriented. I'm just trying to make sure it actually gets us what we need.
It might work because when it first starts streaming, it starts to streaming like the listing, and then it gives you a marker to tell you that the list is done. So if your only goal was to like get the list, then you would get those as watch events, but then you get a marker basically saying you're done with the list, and you could just stop.
I assume you're worried about it making through compaction, Jordan.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out like what happens if it can't finish processing the full set before, I don't know, whatever expires. Like it, if it's doing a no op write to everything, and that takes a while, or it gets throttled, or it goes slow to avoid flooding the server with writes, maybe it doesn't handle the full initial list in time and gets dropped. So then it restarts, but it restarts with the full initial list again. So maybe it's doing internal bookkeeping to make sure it can skip stuff it already handled. Yeah, I just don't know enough about this to know if this is the right fit. Obviously, we would prefer not to paginate and take the memory hit. That would be great if it did work.
So you end up in a rough spot either way. If you have a thing that does a list that is large enough that crashes your QAPI server because it's running on some small thing, you also don't make progress, but you just took everything else out. It's we can certainly debate on a KEP, but it's certainly a case of ask me how I know.
Let that be a strategy the user picks. A server, never make progress in the controller.
I mean, it is frustrating. I don't know how many people have actually been running this, but we've been running.
It's worth making a note and investigating, and maybe it could be adaptive. We just need to make sure whatever we end up with actually has a path to success.
So David, I think OpenShift is the only thing I know that actually runs SVM. Does anybody else actually run SVM?
I would kind of hope every single person with a KMS integration would be doing it.
Just tell people to just run the kubectl command.
I didn't know kubectl was that good. That's kind of impressive.
It's fast enough if you have a good enough connection.
I think GKE ran it in some clusters, but not all. It wasn't universal.
Okay. So yeah, we would move. So I haven't looked at the existing logic. I assume the existing logic at least uses pagination with proper handling of continue tokens, right?
It does, and it'll be a weird handling you've never seen before.
I mean, I vaguely remember it because I wrote a little tiny version of it when I wrote the encryption rest stuff a long time ago. And you were like, "Don't do that, Bob." I was like, "Fine."
I think in the original, I mean, in the SVM, the watch is more like a alphabetical order rather than index, if I get that code correctly. So every time, I think that's how they are also building that continuation token or something like that, so that we can pick it up if it were to crash.
Yeah, it would be good to define if that is a guarantee or if that is just an implementation detail, especially around some of the initial watch stuff. We've seen a lot of like implementation as spec where there wasn't especially well considered behavior, and like ordering on initial synthetic watch events was an example that I know was not super well specified. It may be different for the streaming watch. So if that's the case, that's good. But we need to make sure.
I know list is lexicographical order. I don't know about watch. Certainly don't know anything about the streaming watch stuff. Okay. Let's see. Could you scroll up to the non-goals for a second so I can remember what I said was a non-goal? Do we all agree that we don't have to integrate with encryption at rest in any way? You're all happy with not trying to do that right now? I'm gonna take silence as yes. David, you unmuted, but you didn't say.
I mean, it does surprise me that you wouldn't want to integrate it, but it doesn't bother me.
I'll do it later is the gist.
Okay.
Just don't want to do it right now. I think we talked about the second one. I don't think we're going to use the discovery API for anything new. So I guess the unclear one on non-goal, maybe that one ends up being a goal because of the desire for the whole custom resource stuff.
It seems likely. I guess I would look and say I would prefer to use one API to represent both the both custom resources and built-in resources, rather than trying to shortcut around and using like the CRD schema itself, the CRD status to make those decisions.
Okay. All right. Okay, so we might have to write like a controller that watches for like SVM hash changes and conversions, or sorry, storage version API hash changes and like new conversions, and then runs the migration. I guess something like that. I think on that last one on goals for unclear, do we need anything like a timer or anything like that, or any guarantee of running SVM a particular time? Like, do we need to guarantee that SVM will run for every resource at some interval? Or is that okay to differ?
I was expecting it to only run when requested, so that it didn't have to perpetually scan everything. Are we saying if we want to drop built-in types, then we need to guarantee that it has been run before a given minor version?
Sure, or even just on like the question about the whole custom resource stuff, where you're like, hey, I have this old schema. Who is causing the migration to run? Are we doing it automatically? Are we doing it based on the spec or status of the CRD? Like, what are we using to drive the run?
I have a thought.
Go for it, Han.
Yeah, so Joe's working on this component resource, which is going to help us model cluster lifecycles. And it makes a lot of sense to hook that in there. Like a lot of sense, right? Because once we're transitioning version boundaries, we know exactly where we are in the cluster lifecycle flow. And that's exactly what we need to kick off storage version migration.
Storage version migration is one. So component version transition is one reason for storage version migration, but there's others like
CRDs are different. Yeah, CRDs are different.
Schema changes or KMS key rotation, or like so when you say embed, do you mean like the source of truth for what this thing is doing would be inside that, or that could drive the request to do a storage migration? Having multiple things that can drive storage migration seems good to me.
Yeah, yeah.
KMS,
I agree.
And external stuff, component version changes, internal in-tree storage version changes, CRD schema changes. Okay.
I mean, no one knows when you're like creating new CRDs with new versions and you need storage version migration, but like obviously those have to be kicked off probably manually. But it makes sense for those to be at least, I mean, somewhat reasonable for it to be manual.
There's also, earlier we were mentioning when we were talking about the feature flags about the version skew problems, like it could also be useful for that, right? Like you shouldn't really upgrade beyond a certain point if you haven't done certain storage migrations. I think we might have enough information to kind of do a similar thing here.
Did I miss a section regarding back pressure in Han's write-up, or was back pressure excluded from the versioning changes? Like, say it would be pretty novel to say you cannot upgrade without having done this. I agree, potentially useful here, but very different.
No, I don't think we had it. Did we, Han? I think that's
no. That's going to be part of your thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, maybe.
Maybe.
It's
but
something we want to get to. I'm not sure exactly.
Yes.
It's kind of an idea. It's kind of more a general idea. Like I like Jordan's idea of like we shouldn't have to wait on the feature flags. We already have enough information now. I don't know exactly when we want to do it, but I would like to get there as part of kind of some of the work we're doing on upgrades.
that kind of gets to the version interlock checks that you were talking about, Dave. It's like instead of just saying, do I interoperate with the other versions of stuff in the cluster? It's like, have the things needed to transition to this version been done? That's a lot more detail.
It is. I'm not asking for that. I want to be sure I didn't miss it as already described, because that is okay. Great.
Yeah, no, your question made sense.
To answer your question, Mo, I think starting with it being manual is easier to reason about, and we know we're going to have things driving it that we won't have visibility to. So starting with that surface area gives us like the building block, and then if we want to hook things into it to drive it automatically, we can consider that case by case.
Yeah, so I think that's where my confusion lies, right? So how does what you just said rationalize with what we discussed earlier, where we were talking about hooking it up to custom resources?
So to start, whatever the API object that you create to request a migration, when I make my new CRD manifest, I include one of those migration requests.
Okay.
That's what I would start with. It's the simplest thing that could possibly work. So
Okay.
when I change my CRD1 and stop serving v1 alpha 1, I also throw in a migrate v1 alpha 1 migration request object.
Okay, so that makes sense to me. Would it, in the implementation of this KEP, would we then include any flow that's automatic? For example, if the storage version API is enabled and the hashes change for what API servers agree on, would that trigger a creation of one of these migration thingies? That's the unclear part on there, right? And I was leaning toward don't, because we have plenty of ways to drive these things specifically when told to. But that API isn't complete yet.
Until we're sure that automatically doing a bunch of stuff is what we want, I wouldn't do it automatically. Like, hey, I just got the last server in my cluster upgraded. They all agree, and now, bam! Like now I'm getting a ton of rights, or like I'm not confident that's what we want. So until we are confident, I wouldn't do it automatically. But maybe there's ways to be sure that's what we want, and but I wouldn't do it in the first iteration. I don't know, David, Joe, what do you think?
So when you say first iteration, are you thinking the very first thing that comes in as alpha? Because I would agree. Are you thinking a GA criteria could say, my GA criteria does not include the ability for someone to practically use or to have automatic maintenance, right? So
I think it's more a question of like, what do you want the default state to be? For people who are just upgrading Kubernetes versions who aren't paying attention to this feature, are we envisioning at some point they will do an upgrade, and without them taking any action or changing any invocations, they start getting storage migrations?
I would actually have envisioned it being the case where at a certain level of Kubernetes, when this feature was stable, a user would change their CRD schema to say, I no longer want to serve this version. And this controller would get triggered in some manner to start migrating their custom resource. And then the CRD status would eventually be updated to say, this version is no longer stored. I would have expected that to be the stable state of this KEP.
For CRDs, that would be nice.
And so that means we would do these things. Well, for built-in types, it depends on how it's driven, right? So If you drive it based on a CRD, yeah, it probably wouldn't happen. If you drove it based on a storage version, well, maybe it would. You have something stored that doesn't match what's served. You say, oh, it's unnecessary for this to be stored this way. Let me trigger. That would be a very natural way to do it for a CRD. That would have a side effect of also doing it for a cluster that's been upgraded.
But do we want that? As I think that's where my question lies, right? Is that an actual part of the GA criteria? What Jordan described was a much more conservative, cautious approach of you can do it now, but you have to do it yourself.
But considerably yet less useful for a custom resource author.
I'm not excluding the possibility of auto triggering off of CRD changes in the future. That seems like a useful thing. For the built-in types, I'm less clear.
Okay. So in terms of GA criteria, do you see that as we would have this in the GA criteria? In the GA criteria or not? I think that's what the question is, which would change it from non-goal to goal.
Making CRDs do what I think most people assume they do today and are badly disappointed by seems like a positive direction. Thanks, Federico.
You guys can discuss and tell me.
It sounds like Jordan says, yeah, GA criteria. He's just too polite to say it.
For CRD built-in types, I'm not sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if we do it for CRDs, it's a much smaller problem. It's easier. The API is already sort of there, and you can focus it. You don't have to go mess with an alpha. Have a V1 API you can use.
But it sounds whatever decision we want to make there doesn't block you for alpha, right? So you're.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. I wanted to have a picture of where the thing starts and where the thing ends.
Yeah,
somebody's going to ask me how much time this is going to take us to build.
Yeah, I'm a little torn. I really like the idea of getting CRDs done. Eventually, I would like to get built-ins fully automated, but I don't want to like stop progress in the effort for perfection. And so I would, as long as we have like a North Star and we're working towards that, even if one cat finishes and the other one has to do that other part, I think that still is acceptable in like the sense that like somebody has a task they can complete and we get closer towards the goal.
I will let whoever else is on the agenda.
Okay. We can put more time to keep discussing if it doesn't get resolved offline next meeting. Okay, let's see if we can get there. I don't know if we're going to get to Alex, but Ben, for sure, at least we can start with your topic.
Okay. So for background, I've been looking into the possibility of introducing a new binary serialization format to Kubernetes with the aim of sort of reducing the performance penalty of CR traffic, CR serving and storage, as well as dynamic clients, basically anything that can't take advantage of the generated protobuf serialization. And I've been, making proof of concepts and various comparisons. And one of the challenges to, putting forth a cap on this is that a lot of the strictness and correctness decisions that we make, have an impact on what performance gains we actually see, right? And since that's the overall benefit of even trying to do this, I have a few questions to put to the group and try to collect thoughts on. So the first is decoding of objects with duplicate keys. So today, right, with JSON, we keep the last, we produce non-fatal errors that enumerate all of the duplicate keys that we're seeing. And, depending on field validation options, or I think recognize encoder was the other place. We can interpret these strict errors and do different things. You can reject them or not. Whereas in protobuf, all the generated unmarshal code is for duplicated fields, it's last field wins. And it's the same thing for map elements. The last map element with a key wins. So clearly in JSON, there's ambiguity, right? If you have duplicate keys, it's also a text format. So a lot of users are manually editing JSON and potentially using it in GitOps flow or applying it directly with kubectl. So that's error prone. This strictness is super useful. But like my question is, if we're considering a binary format that we don't expect to be edited by hand, but someone could conceivably send a request, craft a request that has duplicate keys in it. What would such a decoder do? Taking into account there's a performance cost to keeping track of which keys you've seen. And also the fact that we're probably not going to find an off-the-shelf implementation of any binary encoding that does exactly what our JSON fork already does. So I've listed 3 options for discussion. Maybe there's more that I haven't thought of. But the first is do what JSON does identically, which probably requires working with a maintainer of a encoder library or a fork. 2, I include this because some of the existing implementations that I've looked at for binary encoders already support this, and that's just if you have duplicate keys, this is not a valid object for me to decode, and you just fail. I think the performance cost of doing that is probably virtually the same as the first option, but it is available in certain off-the-shelf libraries that I've evaluated. And then the third is sort of what Proto does. Say, hey, we've defined upfront that we're only going to consider your last map item. So it's not an error, but except that we're going to ignore any other duplicates, which is supported, by virtually every encoding library I've looked at, and doesn't have as much performance cost. So I'm curious to hear thoughts or huge misses on why we're doing this with JSON. And I see Joe, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I had 2 thoughts. One is that it's quite plausible that people using YAML would convert to this before sending to the API server. So it's quite plausible that handwritten stuff could come through that pathway. So for example, if kubectl decided to switch from YAML to JSON to API server to YAML to CBOR to API server, then you would expect a lot of pre-existing use cases which might have duplicate keys to come in. The other one is that there might be a 4th option. I don't love it, but I just wanted to mention it, which is you could write a routine that converts from JSON to CBOR and, always only includes the thing that would win, like the last item, and constructs a valid CBOR request that doesn't have duplicates for the server.
If memory serves, the spec actually for CBOR, the RFC actually says duplicate keys are not valid, indeterminate decoding. And if a client was to, say, kubectl, was to convert YAML to CBOR before sending it, that client would be able to decide to error right there, right?
Yeah, that's correct. It's one of 2 validity errors in well-formed CBOR. And the spec also says if you are a decoder, you have to either fail outright or continue with an error marker. Jordan?
I think we have a similar issue actually with YAML and JSON. So if you give kubectl YAML today, it first actually converts it to JSON and then sends JSON to the server. And so it loses duplicate information when it does that transformation. And when we added the server-side validation we captured that duplicate information at that point client side and made use of it. So in kube control, you say kube control apply and you give it a YAML file with duplicate stuff. It first converts that to JSON and says, oh, this has duplicate stuff. Am I being strict? Okay, then fail. And so we could do the same thing when converting to CBOR. That would probably make sense. And like not opening up new ambiguous things we accept on the server seems better to me. Like I would require everyone sending CBOR to the server to send well-formed CBOR and handle the duplicate errors at the transformation point in the client, like we do with YAML to JSON.
Yeah, I agree. What I want is to break a protocol so that there's like Kubernetes CBOR, which is not real CBOR. That seems scary to me.
Okay. So it sounds like we favor just it's invalid CBOR at decode time if there are any duplicates, but not necessarily the strict error business where we're enumerating all of the duplicates.
Yeah, and if there's a client that needs to have backwards compatible behavior, they could, when they do their conversion to CBOR, they could, implement their behavior there, right? So if they want to pick last thing wins, they do that before writing the CBOR, and then they just write the last one in CBOR.
Can you go up, Ben? Maybe I misunderstood the middle issue. Duplicate keys are never acceptable and produce fatal errors on decode. That's what I would have expected the default to be for CBOR. And I would have expected that to be way cheaper, actually, because they don't have to maintain a list. Am I misunderstanding? I thought option 2 would be the default and cheapest.
It depends on the implementation.
Okay.
Most of them expose options where you can decide what to do in this case.
Okay. So yeah, I would go for number 2.
Okay, great. Thanks. How much time do we have? 1 minute. So maybe not enough time to open another topic.
Maybe we carry over for the next meeting if we cannot resolve offline.
Can we get a list of people who are actually interested in going through the others? Because they're likely to take a longer period of time. If we can find time to discuss them, we have, I think, a better shot at resolving. So perhaps assignment for Ben to reach out to everyone via Slack, figure out whether they are interested, to try to put together one-off.
Yeah, that sounds good.
If you need my help organizing that, let me know. Happy to help. Okay, and with that, I think we ran out of time today. I want to thank everybody for joining and participating and keeping the community alive. We'll see you next time. We'll upload the recording later today. Have a great Wednesday.